It is exactly 3:30 in the morning on May 13th, 1968. Deep in the heart of South Vietnam, an Australian artillery base that has existed for only 12 hours is already on the verge of being completely overrun. The defensive perimeter is far from finished. There is no protective barbed wire and no claymore mines have been set. Some of the soldiers are lying in shallow scrapes that are barely 15 centimeters deep. Suddenly, out of the pitch-black darkness, hundreds of North Vietnamese regulars are charging directly toward the artillery guns. What follows is the most intense close-quarters combat Australian gunners have faced to defend their own positions since the Second World War. The crews are forced to wind their howitzers down flat, firing anti-personnel rounds, each containing a cloud of thousands of tiny steel darts, at point-blank range into the oncoming assault. One gun pit is quickly overwhelmed. In the heat of the moment, a young lieutenant makes a nearly impossible decision. He calls for artillery fire to be brought down directly on top of his own men. This is only the first night. Over the next 26 days, two full regiments of the North Vietnamese Army will repeatedly throw themselves at this base and its twin. It will become the largest, longest, and bloodiest battle Australians ever fight in Vietnam. For the commanders who ordered the operation, it would be seen as a massive mistake. To understand why this brutal battle took place, we have to look back 4 months. At the end of January 1968, North Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive, a massive surprise assault on more than 100 cities and military bases across the South. Militarily, the offensive failed at a staggering cost in communist lives, but Hanoi was not finished yet. On May 5th, they struck again. This second wave, known as Mini Tet, hit 119 towns, cities, and installations, with the ultimate prize being Saigon itself. The timing was deliberate. Peace talks were scheduled to open in Paris, and every headline carried weight. Within a week, this offensive was also crushed, with more than 5,500 attackers killed. For the Americans, it was the costliest single week of the entire war. However, defeated regiments do not simply vanish. They withdraw, rearm, and return. The corridors they used to move in and out of Saigon ran through a stretch of territory the Americans referred to as the Catcher's Mitt. This is where the Australians entered the picture. The 1st Australian Task Force, usually based at Nui Dat in Phuoc Tuy Province, was ordered to move about 60 kilometers from their home base to an area of operations codenamed Surfers, roughly 45 kilometers north of Saigon. This force included 2 infantry battalions, 1 RAR and 3 RAR, the guns of 102 Field Battery alongside New Zealand's 161 Battery, and armored personnel carriers. Their mission was to sit directly across the enemy's withdrawal routes and grind down any forces moving through them. On paper, it was a standard blocking operation, but the insertion on May 12th would be anything but standard. In fact, one officer would later describe it with a single word: a debacle. On May 12, 1968, the operation began to fall apart from the very first helicopter lift. There were not enough helicopters available, and the ones they did have were constantly being diverted to support American troops who were in heavy contact just 3 kilometers to the west. Units landed hours behind schedule and in the wrong order. The designated landing zone turned out to be thick with scrub and low trees, forcing a chaotic scramble to a new location. Artillerymen were placed on the ground before the infantry, who were supposed to protect them. Some officers were not even entirely sure of their exact coordinates. There is one detail that is particularly chilling. When the first Australians landed, American soldiers already in the area gave them a stern warning. They told them they wouldn't have to go looking for the enemy because the enemy would come looking for them. Despite this, no one changed the plan. By the time the sun went down, the rifle companies had been pushed out to ambush positions kilometers away, leaving the base itself very thinly defended. The gunners, the mortar platoon, and the headquarters troops were left behind while the defenses were nowhere near complete. No wire was up, and no claymores were set. Most men had only managed to dig shallow shell scrapes. The gunners' pits were only about 15 centimeters deep when the order came to stand to. Then evening rain turned those shallow scrapes into mud and fouled their weapons. They didn't know it yet, but the entire disorganized arrival had been watched. North Vietnamese reconnaissance teams had observed the landing and reported everything to the headquarters of the NVA's 7th Division, located just 9 kilometers away. To the enemy commander, a half-built base with exposed guns and scattered infantry looked like a gift. He ordered an immediate attack. That night, a battalion of the 141st NVA Regiment, reinforced by infiltration groups, closed in on Base Coral, roughly 400 men in total. The Australians had been on the ground for only 12 hours, and the enemy already had a plan to wipe them out. In the early hours of May 13th, the jungle east of Coral erupted in light. Rockets and mortar rounds slammed into the base with precision. The fire was concentrated on two specific targets: the mortar platoon of 1 RAR and the 6 howitzers of 102 Field Battery. When the barrage lifted, the infantry emerged from the tree line in waves. Lines of 150 to 200 men at a time assaulted straight across open ground toward the guns. The forward machine gun teams were nearly wiped out in the opening minutes. One gunner later described seeing the enemy rise out of the dark within arm's reach of his M60 machine gun. They had crawled up undetected and were suddenly everywhere, weapons blazing. The 18-man mortar platoon was overrun, as was the number 6 gun pit. Its howitzer was disabled by a satchel charge, though the sergeant in command managed to strip out the firing mechanism so the enemy couldn't use the gun. The rest of the battery did something artillery is never supposed to do. They leveled their barrels and fired over open sights. They used high explosive and Splintex anti-personnel rounds that burst into thousands of steel darts. At point-blank range against massed infantry, the effect was total obliteration. Overhead, an American spooky gunship saturated the tree lines with its miniguns and dropped flares, while helicopter gunships made repeated runs. But in the middle of the chaos, the 18 men of the mortar platoon were surrounded, with enemy soldiers moving all around them. Their lieutenant, Tony Jensen, watched his position being destroyed bit by bit. Withdrawal was impossible. Then over the radio came an offer that sounded like madness. Jensen later recalled the strange sensation of being watched, suddenly looking up to see a tall North Vietnamese soldier in a pith helmet looking straight down at him. He thought the pith helmet was unusual, as they normally wore soft hats. Realizing they were in deep trouble, he shot the soldier. 5 rounds fired flat across friendly positions finally ended the assault on the mortar line. As dawn broke over Coral, the gunners counterattacked their own pit with grenades and retook gun number 6. The last enemy soldier inside the position was killed at about 10:06 a.m. The cost of that single night was 11 Australians dead and 28 wounded. The mortar platoon alone lost 5 killed and 8 wounded out of 18 men. The attackers left 52 bodies on the position, with blood trails leading into the scrub. The Australians buried the enemy dead in a mass grave next to the gun they had failed to hold. Daylight brought no rest, only constant patrols and contact. On May 14th, there were 9 separate clashes around Coral, and 3 more Australians were killed. That same day, a 19-year-old private named Richard Norton ran 3 times through heavy fire to drag his wounded section commander to safety, and then to recover the body of his forward scout. He was recommended for gallantry on the spot. The enemy probed the base again on the night of the 15th, and in the early hours of May 16th, they returned in force with an assault estimated at up to 3 battalions. But Coral was no longer the vulnerable camp it had been 4 nights earlier. The perimeter was now ringed with armored personnel carriers from the 3rd Cavalry. The rifle companies of 1 RAR had returned, and American self-propelled guns had reinforced the base. Even so, part of A Company's line was overrun and held by the enemy for a time. A young platoon commander, Lieutenant Neil Weeks, reorganized the defense under fire with bayonets fixed and called mortar rounds almost onto his own wire. He would later receive the Military Cross. After 4 hours, the attack was broken. 5 Australians were dead and 19 wounded, along with 2 American gunners. The enemy left 34 bodies and drag marks everywhere, suggesting much heavier losses. On the 22nd, they tried again with rockets and mortars, but Australian counterfire caught them while they were still forming up. Then the defenders received a major reinforcement. Command had passed to Colonel Donald Dunstan, who was likely the last Australian officer alive to have commanded tanks and infantry together in battle back in 1945. Dunstan saw the Centurion tanks of C Squadron, 1st Armored Regiment, sitting idle at Nui Dat and decided to send them. It was a gamble. These were 50-ton vehicles moving in the wet season over 10 Bailey bridges, not rated for their weight. They traveled 120 kilometers through contested territory and made it. On May 23rd, the first troop of Centurions arrived at Coral. Meanwhile, 4.5 kilometers to the north, 3 RAR established a second base called Balmoral. On the 25th, a second troop of tanks moving to join them ran head-on into an enemy bunker system. The Centurions used canister rounds to blast the pinned infantry free. It was the first time Australian tanks and infantry had fought together since 1945. The enemy responded quickly. At 3:45 a.m. on May 26th, the NVA's 165th Regiment attacked Balmoral. A diversion struck from the south while the main assault of a battalion charged D Company across open ground. They didn't know the tanks were there. Two concealed Centurions rolled forward, using machine guns and canister rounds to collapse the assault at the wire. When patrols swept the ground at dawn, they found 6 enemy dead in the usual drag trails. That day cost the Australians 3 killed and 14 wounded. Later that day at Coral, infantry and armor together assaulted the bunker complex found earlier. After hours of close fighting, they pulled back without a single Australian casualty. You would think one massacre on open ground would be enough, but it wasn't. At 2:30 a.m. on May 28th, the 165th Regiment attacked Balmoral again in regimental strength. Artillery and mortars hammered the enemy, and Centurions fired canister rounds into the waves of attackers. The attack lasted 30 minutes. At sunrise, 42 enemy dead lay in front of the position, and 7 prisoners were taken. The Australians suffered 3 wounded and 0 killed that night. A tank crewman, Corporal David Butler, later recalled the horror of seeing the young ages of the dead and the devastating effect of their weapons. 2 days later, the pattern repeated in miniature near Coral, where 2 Centurions destroyed 8 bunkers with canister rounds. After that, the enemy had had enough. The 7th Division pulled back. On June 6th, the Australians handed the area over and returned to Nui Dat. In 26 days, the task force had handed the NVA one of its worst defeats. The final count was 25 or 26 Australians dead and about 100 wounded. On the other side, 267 enemy dead were confirmed, with the true number likely over 300, a loss ratio of more than 10 to 1. The battle happened because Coral sat on the 7th Division's lifelines, and the enemy commander chose annihilation over avoidance. While the Australians made mistakes in reconnaissance and intelligence, the NVA's massed infantry tactics against field guns were outdated. For 50 years, Australia mostly forgot this battle, focusing instead on Long Tan. But recognition eventually came. In 2008, 102 Field Battery received the honor title Coral. In 2018, the units were awarded the Unit Citation for Gallantry. In 2021, Tony Jensen received the Medal for Gallantry. And in 2024, Richard Norden was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. In the Australian War Memorial stands the number 6 gun, the one they overran but could not keep. In 1968, 2 regiments learned that attacking an Australian firebase was a massive mistake. If this story changed the way you look at the hidden sacrifices of history, please subscribe and like the channel. We are unearthing the legacy that time tried to bury. Help us plant the seeds for the future. The next treasury of history will be opened very soon.